This is Writers on Film, the only podcast dedicated to books on cinema. Hello everyone, my name is John Bleasdale. I'm a writer and film critic, and today I'm afraid I've got COVID pretty bad, so that's why this episode is going out a little bit late by a few hours, but I couldn't miss sharing this episode with you. Matt Glasby is a film journalist and writer. He's the author of 3 books, The A to Z of Film Directors, Britpop Cinema, and his latest, which is a book on horror films called The Book of Horror. An Anatomy of Fear in Film. Sorry for garbling that, Matt. And our conversation covers pretty much those subjects. And I'm going to cough in a minute, so I'm just going to let you enjoy the conversation.
The short story. I studied film at university. I moved to Hong Kong randomly. I became a journalist there and specialised in film, obvious reasons. Moved back to London and then slowly worked my way up through. There was a lot more film magazines then. This is like the early noughties. I'm sure you had the same experience. There was a lot more going on, and bit by bit parlayed that into a book writing sideline. I'd love to say career, but it's a sideline. And that's basically where we find us here. I'm a film critic some of the time. I'm a sub-editor a lot of the time, and I write books the rest of the time.
I love sub-editors. They're my favorite. They're my favorite kind of editor.
Someone's got to, haven't they?
Oh man, no, I'm not even kidding. So many times I've got something back with some corrections and gone, oh, thank you so much.
Yeah, it's that thing, isn't it? It's the goalkeeper. Is that like there's so many unthanked moments where you know that you've saved someone something really embarrassing. And I get subbed by other people and they save me from doing embarrassing things, and I'm very happy about that. And also they cut the things that I love and I'm furious about it. But that's that's the deal, isn't it? You just have to take it.
Yeah,
take it as it's intended.
How long were you in Hong Kong, Matt?
18 months or so.
Oh, so kind of quite a good bite.
Yeah, quite a good bite, and it was just incredibly formative. I was going from sort of traveling student-y stuff into, right, what the hell am I going to do with my life? And Hong Kong, as it was then, it's quite easy for someone with no qualifications to get quite far in something. Like you sort of Cowboyville, you can say I'm a so-and-so, and suddenly you are. And so actually, I was 23 and running the film section and chief sub of this reasonably large magazine with no prior experience, because I said that I could, and some idiot took a chance on me. So, it gave you that chance to swim, which would never have happened here. I'd had to have a qualification. I had to work my way through the ranks. I'd have to know basically what I was doing. But that allowed me to sort of guess at it. And, I'm sure you've had the same thing, is that if you go somewhere and you have to pretend enough, eventually you work out actually, how to do the thing you're pretending to do. So it was a hell of an education in a lot of ways.
It's always that thing that people talk about imposter syndrome now, and we nod our heads gravely and go, oh yes, that's a terrible thing, don't worry about it, we all feel like that. But I'm actually an imposter. So I think I invented imposter syndrome to cover my ass.
Yeah. Well, that's it. Everything says, people say, youngsters say, do I need a journalism degree or do whatever? And you're like, what are you talking about? Like, I don't have any of this. I'm sure you do, and I'm sure it's incredibly valuable. But it was quite a strange way into the industry, anyway.
Oh no, I don't have a journalism degree. I never studied film at university, and I never.
Oh wow! So you don't even have that. What are you doing here?
No, I told you, I'm a fucking imposter.
Whereabouts in Italy are you?
Northeast, near Venice.
Oh, okay.
So I go in and teach in Venice a couple of days a week, 2-3 days a week, and then.
That sounds nice.
Oh, it's gorgeous! It's gorgeous. I live a blessed life, Yeah, then I was going to ask you about the Hong Kong thing as well. Were you sort of like attracted there also because of the cinema, or did you, the Hong Kong films coming out of
No,
the
it was purely personal. It was
right?
the girl I was going out with at the time lived there, and we'd both finished university. I was from Exeter, which is a lovely city in the southwest, but not exactly full of prospects for your young film hopeful. And I didn't have a better idea, so I went to Hong Kong and started out there, and it worked out pretty well. As long as that went on, it worked out pretty well, as I said. And yeah, then landed back in London with at least, I've done this and I've done this and I've done this, even if those were for I hesitate to use the term cowboy organization, but, but for a magazine, for a cowboy organization in Hong Kong, basically. And that gave me the chance to sort of toe hold my way in and say, well, I am this and I can do this and I could do it. But I'd learned a rather strange way.
And so you've published a number of books. I'd start with the one I've read most recently, which is your book on Britpop cinema. Okay.
Yeah.
That's a really interesting concept. I hadn't even really considered that as a sort of genre. Do you want to just explain for us that sort of genre for us?
Yeah, the idea is that especially a little while ago, we were looking back at the 90s in Britain and, New Labour, Cool Britannia, Britpop music. I don't know about you, but I was in my mid-teens around that era, so it was quite an exciting era anyway. And there's lots of, column inch has been expended on Oasis versus Blur, and this is the sort of the new 60s for English creativity and also British creativity, and also Britain considering itself a creative power. We got rid of grunge and then had our own bands and talking in your own vernacular. And it occurred to me that we also did that in cinema, but that no one had really ever written about it. And what I then sought to do was sort of plot what I considered to be Britpop cinema, which was often in the wake of Trainspotting and Danny Boyle sort of related, or people often aping his style, but was a sort of confident new cinema that it seemed in the 80s growing up, there was like Merchant Ivory, costume drama, and there was Mike Leigh, gritty realism, and we didn't have anything in the middle. And this felt like Britpop cinema, your Trainspottings, your Human Traffics, your Lock Stocks, felt like we had sort of entertaining films that were very, very British. They had some of them had subtitles in America because they were so British.
Oh, is that true? I always thought that was a myth. That's actually
they did the
with Trainspotting.
Certain scenes of Trainspotting were subtitled, yes, for sense, not the whole thing, but certain scenes were.
Right.
And I believe, I'm not sure about the others actually. Maybe some of it was re-recorded.
Gregory Girl, which is in the 80s, Gregory's Girl, they did a different version. They dubbed it essentially from Scottish into, I presume, a more understandable Scottish for the Americans. Yeah.
Oh, not so they didn't dub it into American, because that would have been great.
God, now as soon as we finish this episode, I'm going to go onto YouTube and check out if there is one. But no, that's what I heard anyway. That's something I heard an interview, I think, on the film program years ago, and they were talking about how it was in the States. It was redubbed.
So that's a big part of it. So the idea that we were making films for ourselves, and if the rest of the world cared or interested, then so be it. And that there was a sort of peak of British film production, and there's a lot more money going into it, and there was a lot more interesting sort of your Trainspotting, etc. And that started around that point with Trainspotting, Danny Boyle, and probably ended with This Is England. I was sort of putting as the last of that version of that film quite a lot later. And so, I was just trying to chart a movement that I sort of largely made up, but I do think existed and hasn't been paid the sort of attention that the book paid it.
Yeah, I think it's really convincing. It's a really convincing argument. And
Thank you.
Especially I like the way as well you sort of say, some certain films of a filmmaker belong in this category, but other films of the same filmmaker don't necessarily. So I think Shane Meadows, you use This Is England as your last point, but you say no, Dead Man's Shoes. No, that's not Britpop.
I love that film, but no way is it. One of the things about Britpop cinema is that it's enthusiastic, it's optimistic, it's full of this like new label, we can do it. And Dead Man's Shoes is the darkest film, but one of the darkest films you'll ever think to see. So yes, there are lots of films of that period which aren't Britpop cinema. And obviously one of the joys of if you've invented your own very niche term is that I get to decide what's in it, because like who's going to argue? I mean, so
I wrote the book. Yeah, I wrote that book.
Exactly. I literally coined that term, and I'd be very welcome to debate what should be included in it, but I do get the final say on that one, definitely.
You're the arbiter. That's good. Yeah. That's brilliant. That's brilliant. But I mean, it makes sense because the word pop has that sort of optimism about it and that energy. And I mean, you refer to Hard Day's Night, and I like the way you put it sort of in a historical context as well. Also, the historical context of the 80s being, you quote figures of investment in film going from something like 200 to almost 300 million pounds a year in the beginning of the 80s, and by the end of it, it's like 70 million. It's, I mean, a huge drop. So that, I mean, it's like, the British film industry like didn't decline; it was murdered.
Yeah, I mean, it's hard. So that looking back at it for the book, you look at it from a historical perspective and trying to prove things. But looking at it from someone that grew up in the 80s, there was no British films were of any interest. It was all Hollywood. And then, so it's 92 and you can go and see Peter's Friends or something like that. And then suddenly it's 94 and you can go and see Shallow Grave and all this stuff. And that just seemed to me like complete worlds apart, like what had changed in these few years. And it turns out an absolute number of things, from the mood of the nation to financing to, all those sorts of things. So it did feel like there was an unexplored movement to explore. And actually, I spoke to lots of the filmmakers from the time, and some of them said, this is total bollocks. There wasn't a movement. And others went, oh, that's interesting. So, the jury's out. But it was definitely an interesting way of looking back at this really exciting period of cinema.
This is the thing about critics, is we sort of do get the opportunity to say to people, this was a movement, and look at these 5 people together who are working, and they don't have to know it. They're not the experts. You make the films. We'll decide if it's a movement or not.
Yeah, exactly. And so that, the book goes into that as a movement. And it was I thought I'd found a niche that no one had written about, and it turns out I had. But I think that also means sometimes when you find a niche, it means there's an amazing opportunity that the world's waiting for this niche, and sometimes there's a niche because no one really cares. So I think on the world stage, the world was not rocked by the release of Britpop cinema, but hopefully some people in more parochially and in UK cinema, thought it was interesting.
Oh my God, you're talking to somebody who's running a podcast exclusively devoted to books on cinema. So we instead of edgelords, we're niche lords, baby. Yeah. What was and also one of the things I liked about it is you didn't make any sort of big claims necessarily for quality. There were some of the films obviously that you thought were amazing, and Trainspotting obviously one. And then there were other films that you were like, yeah, it is definitely a Britpop film, but it's not very good.
Yeah, I mean, that's the problem, isn't it?
Shooting Fish was one of those.
Shooting Fish, Spice World. There's all these films that are very representative of the times, and they totally fit in that category and are pretty terrible. And as you said with Dead Man's Shoes, there's lots of films of the time that are brilliant and don't fit in the category. So you find yourself as like a huge Dead Man's Shoes fan writing, 5,000 words on Spice World, and then 500 words on Dead Man's Shoes. You're like, what has happened to the world? That, why am I writing a Shooting Fish chapter? But
I've never even seen Spice World. Is there anything redeeming in it? Is there a campness that you can enjoy now?
Yeah, maybe there's a lot of effort. It's not boring. There's a ton of things happening, and looking at it now, there's lots of cameos from people that would now be considered incredibly cut rate. So, oh my God, it's Michael Barrymore, which might have been a coup in 1996 when they made it, or 97, but suddenly obviously isn't. And then, it's Jules Holland. Jules Holland's on TV every night. It's not. And so it's that thing where it must have felt star-studded. But now you look back and you're like, wow, you've got Jules Holland and Michael Barrymore on the same film set. Like, this isn't...
Yeah, I mean, in the 90s, I don't even think Michael Barrymore in the 90s was that bigger. I mean, certainly not that in terms of their ambitions of being international pop stars.
Yeah.
I mean, you watch, how many people in America are going to be watching it going, oh, Jules Holland?
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
Oh, I love Strike It Lucky. I mean, no, right. No one's gonna... And I think I spoke to the guy, the producer, and he said, this was just a case of how long are they going to be famous for? Let's bang this out. Let's make as much money as possible. And he was very honest about that.
Right.
And I know the Spice Girls are their influence is being re-looked at again through sort of less gendered eyes, and I'm all behind that. But yeah, the film is still not good.
Right, there's no redeeming, there's no rescuing it for future.
No, I don't think so. No, I mean,
I don't know. I mean, I don't know. Films like sort of Showgirls have been sort of re-evaluated, retaken. Adam Nyman was on the podcast talking about that. But there are other films that are just bad, I think. I mean, Bullseye, Michael Winner, that's a film that, it's so bad, it's just still bad.
Bullseye, based on the game show?
No, okay. that would have been better.
I would watch that.
Yeah, exactly. No, this is a Michael Winner. I tell you, it makes you cry when you think of the sort of people involved, the talent involved. It's Michael Caine and Roger Moore in a kind of dirty, rotten scoundrels sort of caper, and it's awful. It's just awful. It's just badly written, poorly directed, and surprisingly from the director of Death Wish 3. It's just, it's really, really naff. And there's no sort of enjoying it for it being, which I always find a very dubious quality anyway, that idea of, it's so bad, it's good. There are exceptional cases like The Room, which, is genuinely sublimely brilliant. Because it's so awful.
Yeah, I mean, it's about things being made by people of talent or of really going for something, isn't it? Where sometimes things are just made by people with no talent who aren't really going for something, and that is often quite hard to watch.
Yeah, but that's Michael Winner. That's his entire...
Okay, well, I probably will give Bullseye a miss, to be honest. Also, we've got to remember, having researched that book, I've watched a lot of terrible British films that fell by the wayside for various reasons. So yeah, I don't need to add to that list. I want to see the good stuff.
What about a Britpop film that hasn't got the high profile that obviously Trainspotting and Made in England, maybe a little bit more forgotten? What film would you recommend of that genre?
That's a very good point. It's still got a profile, but I mean, I think Human Traffic is very, very underrated. I think it looked a lot like Trainspotting because it's got a voiceover and it's got sort of, obviously drug taking and that sort of thing. So it looked like a copycat, but actually it was made by the director of real talent and a really great cast, and it's just got that kind of lovely feel to it. And I would have loved to have seen more from the director. He only made one more film so far, so I think that's underrated still. And I think anyone that watches that has a really good time.
I just remember seeing that at the cinema and thinking, God, who's that actor? He's amazing. It's the first time I've ever seen him, and waiting for the credits to go up, and it was Danny Dyer. I think, right, I'll remember that name. He's going to be a star.
It's a funny old game, isn't it?
Yeah. But he's genuinely brilliant in that film. He's absolutely great.
Yeah, he's got a lot of charisma, back then, and that's something like a film like that's based around. Is actually all of the leads have got a tremendous charisma. They all seem to really get on, and you just want to spend time in their company, which I think looks very easy. But actually, once you've got that down, you can do anything with a film. You can make it hours long. You could have all sorts of sort of twists of fantasy because they're just really nice, normal kids, and they've got a ton of charisma, and they look like they're having a great time.
Yeah. And the other one you were going to say?
I was going to say 24-Hour Party People. Obviously, it's Michael Winterbottom, so it's known, but even they say themselves, it's the Steve Coogan playing Tony Wilson of Factory Records, and they say themselves it just arrived at the wrong time. It was 2002, 3 maybe, and this Britpop cinema wave that I've been talking about, it just sort of crashed. Companies were going out of business. People weren't so interested in this stuff anymore, and it just didn't get the audience that it deserves. But it's really, really, really funny. There's almost anyone you can name in alternative British music or alternative British comedy pops up for 2 seconds. And it's one of those films you can sort of rewatch and rewatch and rewatch. If it's on late at night, you watch 5 minutes, you're watching the whole thing.
Yeah, 24-Hour Party People. I've seen that. I thought that was a really decent sort of cross-genre film as well. It's not quite a biopic, and it's not quite it feels a little bit almost like a comedy documentary.
Yeah, and also just, you'd say Steve Coogan, Paddy Considine, Sean Harris, Simon Pegg. You could just list Andy Serkis. Like, I'm going to forget some people, but the list, Peter Kay here, like, just this amazing, amazing cast. Shirley Henderson, keeps on going of people you're like, oh my god, in even the tiniest roles.
Yeah, no, that's definitely, both of those films I would definitely heartily recommend as well. Yeah, no, absolutely. Okay, so and then you did. I'm not sure. I'm not taking these chronologically. I'm taking them by the order of me reading them. You've done a sort of encyclopedia of horror, basically, an A to Z of horror, right? Horror movies.
Yep.
What was sort of the motivation for that? Was that was it a company that you were working for, or how did that come about?
Well, so the book is the Book of Horror, very easy to remember. And I've got to credit Barney Barduano, who does the beautiful black and white illustrations throughout. Maybe we'll talk about that later, but his stuff's just amazing. I've been a horror fan my whole life. That is the bit of film that's the one for me, and literature and what have you. That is my biggest passion. And after I wrote Britpop Cinema, I came up with an idea for the scariest. Basically, there's lots of books on horror about the history of horror, and The Exorcist is important because of this, and the 1930s were a golden age because of that. But when I watch a horror movie, I want to know if it's scary or not. And it's fine if it's not. There's lots of great horror movies that aren't scary, or horror comedies or what have you. But my personal thing is I want to know that it's scary. And other than that, I don't really care. And there is no single book out there collating the scariest movies ever made. And yet, to me, that's a massive factor. So I pitched a book collating the top 100 scary movies ever made. And then I got a publisher, Quarto. I've got a publisher called Quarto, and they suggested some changes to the format, and basically we came up with the format together. But the idea was that it would collect the scariest films ever made, and that some of the films in the book aren't good films, and some of them in this and some of them in that, but all of them are scary. And that was that seemed to me an interesting USP.
Yeah, that is an interesting point, that it being scary doesn't necessarily make it a good film. Being a good film doesn't necessarily mean it's going to be scary. I mean, I don't find The Shining at all scary. And I was trying to think about this the other day, whether I ever did, because I can't remember a time that I hadn't already seen The Shining 10 times.
Yeah.
So I can't remember that first viewing. And very recently, like 4 years ago, I think, I saw it at Cannes. They did a new print and a mass 4K sort of whatever, and they showed it. And for the first time, I kind of found it. That's the scariest I've ever found it. Was on the big screen in a cinema, and it suddenly became a lot creepier.
Yeah, there are scenes for me which are really creepy. Obviously the women in the bath and stuff, the trikes around the corridor. I do agree that overall it probably isn't as scary as its reputation suggests. I think we know too much about it. I think there's Kubrick's famous sort of locked down control, which I think you can feel, and it doesn't necessarily help a horror scenario. I think Jack Nicholson's too famous. The famous Stephen King quote about low budget horror, and I really do think it's easy to scare people if you don't know anything about the people you're watching. If you have, it's easy for it to feel like an artifact of Blair Witch Project and Evil Dead. Big blockbuster horror doesn't tend to be very scary. The Shining is a strange one, and I've had a strange relationship with it. There's been times I've hated it. There's been times I really thought it lacked, and then watching it over the years and watching it again for the book, I've sort of come to the conclusion that it's like a beautiful but flawed thing that's not exactly for me, but has incredible moments. Maybe it doesn't all hang together. I got a lot of stick for that opinion as a horror critic. It's not a popular one to have. But yeah, it is. The world is more interesting with The Shining in it than without it. But yes, it's a flawed piece of work for me. But here's me calling Kubrick flawed. So,
well, no, I mean, he is one of those. My favorite filmmakers sort of have made a large number of sort of what I would consider flawed masterpieces. I love Sergio Leone, but I think Once Upon a Time in America is incredibly problematic.
Right.
And I love Kubrick, and I think Clockwork Orange and The Shining are both have their problems. But I find those flawed masterpieces kind of more interesting than a lot of people's perfect films.
Yeah, there is a lot more to write about. I mean, there are more successful horror films for this book that are a lot harder to write about, because actually they're quite boring. What they're doing is quite, good jump scares or what have you. Whereas, people have made documentaries about mad theories about The Shining, and will continue to debate it, for the rest of time. So, yeah, I think it's just one of those ones that's an interesting film. But yeah, it's not a personal favorite of mine.
I love the breakdown that you have in the book of sort of different types of scares as well. There's a different levels of fear, because I think that's a really interesting point.
Well, yeah, the publishers, Alice, my amazing editor, they wanted an extra aspect to this book. They wanted something that you couldn't find elsewhere, and it was their suggestion was to. So I wanted this, the scariest films ever, and they said, fine, but what we want you to do is we want you to break down why they're scary. So we came up with this system of 7 scare tactics that I think every single film has, and use them as like a graphic equalizer. So some films have got this one turned right up and this one turned right down. And that it was interesting to chart. Most successful horror films do all of these 7 things in different forms. And it'll be really interesting to chart them. And that sort of provided an extra level to the book, which was really interesting to go back over some of these films. I knew like the back of my hand, but to go back over them with an idea, trying to work out exactly what they were doing.
So what are those 7 qualities? Just remind me.
Well, I'm glad you asked. I had to write this down because obviously they're my 7 scare texts. I thought I'm going to forget this. So, and I'll give you a little explanation as to what they mean as well.
Sure, great.
So the first one is dead space, which is it's a sort of about framing, and it's in negative space and positive space. Now, negative space is when there's loads of extra room around the subject of the shot, so it constantly feels like something is going to, be revealed. So say in It Follows, you've got great big wide frames and you're constantly searching for something in the back of them. And then positive space is when you're up very close to a subject and anything that suddenly intrudes into that frame is going to be really jarring. So that's dead space, the framing of characters and how things intrude to them.
Right.
The second thing is the subliminal, which is anything that we don't notice is happening. So it might be subliminal inserts in The Exorcist, or it might be, buzzing bees on a soundtrack or something, which you're not going to register, but actually gives you a kind of fight or flight response. The third thing, and this is pretty common, is what I call the unexpected, which is like jump scares, plot twists. Say Marion being killed off early in Psycho is the unexpected, and it stops you trusting the world you're seeing. The grotesque, number 4, this is probably the simplest. It's basically blood, broken bodies, aliens, horrible things, and when we see them, we have a physical reaction to them, and that's akin to fear. Revulsion and fear are pretty close.
Right.
Number 5 is dread, which is a really beautiful thing for a horror movie, and it's something like the Blair Witch Project, where you don't know what's going to happen, but something awful, and you're constantly waiting for it to come. Number 6 is the uncanny, which obviously goes back to Freud, which is sort of nightmare imagery, something that's just not quite right. Dolls that move or
clowns.
What have you. Sorry?
Clowns,
exactly. Yeah. And number 7 is the unstoppable, which is the sense in horror movies that something's been unleashed that can't be put back in. And that could even be like, repetitive score, or it could be the way most horror movies sort of at the end come back to the beginning or leave you unresolved. And that's the unstoppable. And most horror movies do that to some degree as well. So those are the 7. And yeah, the idea is that some things are very grotesque, but don't have much dread. And some things that, are deeply uncanny, but don't have any subliminal things. And, there's you can plot a path between those things to tell you what kind of scares you're going to get.
And so is that also sort of how you would define horror movies as well? It's sort of like it has to have several of these elements, or it has to have, a major... Because, I know, for instance, say Kim Newman writing about horror movies, he actually sort of coined the phrase nightmare movies because he wasn't happy with horror as a sort of generic, as a word, really, Well,
I'm not going to go against Kim because he's the master. But, the definition I've used for the book is a horror film is a film that sets out to scare you.
Right.
So there's a lot of things that I've left out, things I don't consider to be horror movies. And that's one of those, we could debate for hours on end about some of those things. But I think something that sets out to scare you through its subject matter, often as well through its style. You could have a documentary, you could have a drama about a serial killer, you could tell these stories in different ways, but you could make a horror film about that serial killer, and that would make you afraid of what it is he's going to do and how he does it and those things. So yeah, I think when you're watching a horror movie, I think you just from a few frames that's what it is.
I would agree. I think it's one of those things that it's a little bit. I mean, I think there was a Supreme Court justice who said about the same thing about pornography. Said, I know what it's very difficult. It's very, very difficult to define, but I know exactly what it is when I see it. And so it was
that's a good one.
Essentially, anything I say, that's porn or that's a horror. That's what it is. It's a bit like you and Britpop.
Exactly. Yeah. There's a pattern here, isn't there? No, I mean, one of the things with so you call this something the book of horror, and you set out to analyze the scariest movies ever made. So immediately you have to start putting in boundaries, because you can't go, right, well, I watch every film ever made. You can't even go, I watch every horror film ever made. You need to establish dates between. We didn't do anything pre-World War II. So it felt to me that often that stuff is amazing, but it isn't still scary in the way that we mean. That was a good cut-off point. So it only gave me 75 years of horror films to get through, as opposed to 125. And things like that. You do have to narrow down that definition, and that obviously is open to interpretation, and it leaves things out that people want included. But that's the nature of it's a book. It has to have an end.
What was the first film that really sort of scared you in a real maximal sort of like, oof,
I've been trying to think this, and I just remember growing up soaked in horror and soaked in, probably the same for most people, Stephen King and James Herbert, what have you. I do remember being very young. Basically, they'd show horror movies late night on maybe Channel 4, ITV. You'd record them on video. This is like mid 80s, late 80s, and you'd just get what you were given. So you might get like a cheesy Hammer film, or you might get something like David Lynch or something. So there's no real preparation for the I must have been 8 or 9. So I recorded Friday the 13th Part 6, which is one of the good ones, off telly, because I thought I'd be well into Jason. I'd read about this stuff, and then the next day I watched it with my lovely gran. And it's really, really violent. Like, it's really violent by Friday the 13th standards. And we were both just quite horrified, but obviously for me that led to a career in horror journalism, and for her it probably led to just thinking, what have we done, what have we raised. But yeah, I remember that really clearly, and just thinking it was brilliant. And actually I love that film to this day.
That's something I'll have to put on my list. Friday the 13th, I've watched the first and the second. And I think it was one of those things that they had it on Amazon Prime or somewhere. They had all of them. And I thought, right, and I watched the second. And then the next day they took them all off. So it was like, I'd already seen the first, watched the second, was really, really into the idea of doing them one at a time and just going through them in a week. And they took them all off the next day. And it was like,
that would be quite a week. I mean, I say that as a big fan, but that is a big ask to watch them all like back to back.
Yeah, I enjoy doing that sort of stuff. Like, I remember our local cinema showed all the Rocky films before Rocky 4 came out. So you saw, and they would do this thing. They did the same thing with Star Trek before Voyage Home came out, and they just marathoned them, and then they'd show the last one would be the latest one. So.
Right,
yeah, it was a real formative experience of sort of a Barrow in Furness Astra Cinema.
Shout out.
Yeah,
if you're listening.
It's not there anymore. It's not there anymore. Now there stands a statue of Emmeline Hughes, who I once I queued to see Star Wars.
Emmeline Hughes, the Liverpool football player.
Yeah, he was from Barrow. He was a Barrow in Furness lad. Yeah, claim to fame for Barrow in Furness.
That's so brilliant. That's so brilliant in these small towns, isn't it?
Yeah.
You've lost the cinema, but you've gained a statue of Emmeline Hughes.
Yeah. Yeah, come on. He was on Question of Sport all the time in the 1980s. He's in Spice World.
He might be,
He could be one of the ones. So I mean, I'm always surprised as well when there are films. There are films which still really, really scare me. I would say my partly because it was another formative experience, but Texas Chainsaw Massacre. I still find that I can't watch that film. I mean, it's
not safe, is it? It's not been made safe.
And it's like that thing you said about big budget horror as well. Somebody found. I was talking to Rob Savage, who did the. He did Host. And we were talking about Texas Chainsaw Massacre, and he said it's like it's been found in a dirty bath. It's just like there's sort of like they just got the film canisters out of a dirty bath and put them in the machine, and that's what you're watching.
I said Wes Craven said, we're all making these horror movies, but that one just felt like someone had gone and started killing people and they'd filmed it. And so true. And if Wes Craven's saying that, then you're doing something right.
Absolutely. Why can't, I mean, that's the thing, is big budget. I don't think, I mean, there have been some really good examples, but I think they've got the right idea with Blumhouse of going back to a sort of really limited budget and good ideas, because good ideas are kind of cheap,
Yeah, well, I mean, you mentioned Rob Savage and Host. I mean, I don't know what Host cost to make, but this is the lockdown horror released last year. But I mean, that's surely an example of ingenious, presumably very, very low to no budget filmmaking that everyone's still talking about 18 months later, which just shows that we needed a good idea and some skill, and especially with horror that can get you onto the world stage. To take the Blair Witch or something like that. So actually, you don't need to throw these massive bucks behind it. And it's also, as we said earlier, a little bit counterproductive. I think you can see, the trailers, you can see the makeup trucks, you can kind of in your mind see how much people are pretending, and then you watch something like the Blair Witch Project, and the cast are genuinely terrified, and it's genuinely terrifying. Obviously, you can't just torture people and film it. That's not ethical, and it wouldn't work. But you can see on people's faces the degree of acting they're doing, I think, in this thing.
William Friedkin, I think, might argue that point.
How do you mean?
Well, it's some filmmakers who go to extremes to get illicit reactions. Yes. I mean, on The Exorcist, he was slapping priests, for crying out loud.
Yeah, that's true. That is a big budget horror film that feels dangerous and has a lot of elements of the real about it. It's another one I've got a strange relationship with, but yeah, people are nuts about. Like, people are fanatical about The Exorcist, I would say. You can't, to say there are flaws in the film is to invite an avalanche of criticism, believe me. But it's a really interesting one.
What flaws have you pointed out with that one?
Well,
just to invite a lot of aggro.
So it's very slow. Mm-hmm. It's quite confusing as to exactly who everyone is and what's happening. The astronaut, things like that, aren't really very well explained in the film. You need to read the book to get a clue about those things. You have an exorcist at the start that disappears for like an hour and then comes back and needs reintroducing, which may be how. I know it's based on some element of true stories, and maybe that may be what happens, but from a film point of view, it isn't particularly elegant. Some of the effects are actually awesome, but they look more and more like effects now, which isn't a problem. They still look great. Just those things like that. I'm not saying necessarily those are flaws, but those are things which I think might be barriers for someone today, it having the same effect on as it clearly did in the 70s on people.
I read the book before I saw the film as well, and it was it might have been a couple of years after I read the book because it was kind of difficult to get hold of. I'm talking about, 84, 85,
The film or the book?
The film.
Mm-hmm.
The book was one of those books that was like handed around school,
Yeah.
That it went around school and everybody read the same copy, basically. And also I went to a Catholic school, and I think the Catholicism of The Exorcist is the most terrifying thing. The most terrifying thing for me about The Exorcist was like, oh shit, the priests are right,
Yeah, it's true. Actually, in a religious world, that film's a lot scarier than in a secular one. That's true. I grew up atheist, so I never factored in this stuff. But you're right. Especially if you've been told, Catholicism's the truth, and then to see that film, and it obviously is very realistic, and it is done in that Friedkin style of sort of, I've just happened to have filmed this, that sort of semi-documentary style. Yeah, it's a film that I admire more than I like.
Well, we won't tell Mark Commode because I know he gets very very upset about that. I really quite like The Exorcist 2 as well. I know that's got.
That's one I haven't seen. Everyone told me it was rubbish. I didn't think it was going to be scary, so I didn't watch it for this. Obviously, The Exorcist 3 has got its plus points, and was, I think, it was almost included in the book, and then I decided not quite. It's a little bit too surreal. It's just got that one great jump scare. But yeah, I'd love to see Exorcist 2 actually, even if it's an absolute sort of train wreck. It's a train wreck full of really talented people. So.
Exactly, and John Boorman is no slouch when it comes to directing a movie. Richard Burton, even in terrible movies, is always worth watching. Yeah, there are. I saw it years ago, so I don't want to vouch for it too loudly, and then rewatch it and think, what was I talking about? This is awful. But yeah, no, What other movies did you include in the sort of upper echelon of the scare factor then?
Ooh, that's a good question. It's difficult, isn't it? Because what we've got here is that you've got a very subjective thing as how scary something is. And then the book is trying to find a sort of science behind that. But ultimately, there is a subjective aspect. And so it is, so the things that I found scariest in it. I mean, throughout the book, we try and chart how each film, the moments of which each film is scariest. And I think some of the scariest moments through that would be ending of the Blair Witch Project, the beginning of Suspiria, Sadako coming through the screen in Ringu, the appearance of Leatherface in Texas Chainsaw Massacre, behind the sort of charnel house door and just appearing with a big hammer.
God.
So those are obviously some of the huge scare moments, because those are the scariest things, some of the scariest things I've ever seen, some of the scariest moments in film history.
Just the bit where he hits the guy with a hammer and the guy's foot does this jerky sort of.
Oh, that's
like...
I went to see that. It was banned, obviously, and they re-released it when I was a student, and I went to see it with my lovely dad. There's a bit of a pattern here. I dragged my dad along.
Stop going to see horror movies with members of your family, Matt.
And because I thought, this would be great, we've wanted to see it all this time, because you read about these things, but you can't see them when they're banned like that way. And so we saw it in Exeter Picture House, and it was me and my dad and a bunch of students, and that scene happened, and I just felt this chill, this absolute chill. It scared the absolute hell out of me. And everyone else laughed. And I know people say that there's a sort of black comedy aspect to the film, which I could sort of see. I just find it terrifying and very traumatic to watch. But yeah, my dad and I were sort of clutching each other's hands, terrified. And the rest of the audience was just peeing themselves. It was just such an odd, they were laughing at it. And I don't really know why, but obviously it was provoking a reaction. And yeah, we were really, really scared. And I stand by that to this day, that it's terrifying.
Do you think there's a danger so we're talking about context in a sense, about me going to a Catholic school and watching Exorcist and going, ooh. But also I sometimes find some horror fans have a sort of machismo or whatever is the non-gendered version of machismo, sort of, it's sort of jaded. Nothing scares me. This isn't, and then until it goes very, very extreme. Is that a sort of danger with horror, that you sort of desensitized to it?
Definitely. And it was part of the conditions of watching it was that I was watching a lot of these things, and I had to kind of check myself that, if you watch The Others after Texas Chainsaw Massacre, you might think that it's quite a gentle, quite a gentle film. It's got Nicole Kidman in it, whatever. If you watch it on its own, and obviously it is a really scary and beautiful film, but so there needed to be some sort of sensitivity to how I watched things, because actually, and also if you watch something, I was watching 5 or 6 films a day in research. So some of those were first thing in the morning, some of those were last thing at night. Obviously there's a difference there. You get this at film festivals when, midnight movies that are quite kind of schlocky and fun get amazing audience reactions. Whereas if you put something like Martyrs on at midnight, everyone's going to be like, oh my God, just make it stop. So, there's definitely a way to that. And I'm sure people out there are seeking things and desensitized to them. I didn't find that. I actually found that what happened is that I watched so many horror films in such a short period of time that I started to kind of, if I say see things, that's going to make you think that I lost my mind. But it's more that when you were suddenly passing something, it's more like out of the corner of your eye. And because you're watching so much horror imagery, my brain kind of filled in the gaps. So for that period, I did things got pretty intense. And, I'd pass an empty car or something, and I just think, was there someone in that car? Was there like a skeleton in that car? And look back, and there's nothing in there.
Every van's a murder van.
Yeah, it wasn't that I was being haunted. It wasn't that I was gone crazy. It's just obviously that if you load your brain with all that imagery, you're gonna start seeing it back at yourself. So don't watch 8 horror movies a day for 6 months. Basically, it's the thing. Don't do that, because it's really bad for you.
With your grandma, with various members of your family.
I wish any of my family had been up for it, but no, it's just me. So don't do that.
Did you get to the point where you'd open a cupboard door and then you'd close it and you'd be like, somebody should have been there, really? That's the...
No, but like I say, just whenever there was a gap to be filled by my brain, it filled it with something really bad. And it took a little while to wear off, and it did wear off, obviously. But I was glad when it did, and I needed a break afterwards.
Do you think there is, of those 7 things that you sort of graded, do you think there's a kind of hierarchy to them sometimes, in the sense that, like, for instance, jump scares, right? I always, was it Hanif Qureshi or someone said, nothing scary happened in this movie. Just a few loud things happened suddenly, and it's like, oh, okay, yeah, that's the pretty good definition of a lot of horror films.
I think there's something to be said for all of them. And if you have a movie that relies only on jump scares, then you probably have a pretty dumb movie. It might work, and it might work the first time, but it's unlikely to have that. We're talking about The Exorcist now from 1973. It's unlikely to have that kind of continuation. Whereas actually, the things that work best do use different elements of these things at different times. So you watch something like The Orphanage, which I think is a beautiful film and really scary. Mostly, it's dread. It's uncanny, little masks and that kind of stuff. But there's a jump scare, spoilers for people who haven't seen it, halfway through, where someone you believe to be dead jumps up at the camera, not quite dead. And this is a very subtle movie. This is a movie that doesn't rely on jump scares. But that jump scare is absolutely brilliant. And I watched it in a critic screening, and there was like a sort of venerable newspaper critic next to me. And honestly, I thought he was a goner, because he just went like, it was so well done. And yet, so if that movie had only been those jump scares, they'd have dissipated it in effect. But using that one amongst all the dread and amongst all the kind of subtle stuff was brilliant.
Yeah, and that's a good point. It's kind of like all ingredients to make to bring together with the recipe.
Yeah, exactly. This is a feast. Your beautiful horror movie, and one of the courses is the unexpected, is jump scares, is whatever, and another course is grotesquerie. But equally, if it's all wall-to-wall body horror, you may find that people are no longer scared, that they're enjoying it or taking it in a different way. Like splatter movies don't tend to be scary, do they?
But there are certain sort of there's a certain sort of genre or subgenre of American horror movie that seems to be like an action movie, where instead of the action scenes, you just have like an elaborate death. So I mean, I'm thinking Final Destination or something like that, where you're not really, it's not scary. It's just like, how are they going to die? This time, escalator. Oh, okay, let's see what happens here.
I love those films, but they're not scary, and they're not in the book for that reason. And ditto Friday the 13th, actually, there's nothing really that raises a pulse that much. Ditto Nightmare on Elm Street, which is a bit more contentious, leaving out the first one, but actually it just feels like Freddy is so well known to people, and the sort of wisecracking and the product placement and stuff, that he is no longer that scary to a modern audience, which I accept might be controversial, but that's just the way I feel looking back at the films. I'm not saying they're without merit, just that like he's become something else.
When Rick and Morty do a really good parody of the Nightmare on Elm Street movies, where he keeps saying bitch at the end of every, and then he goes home and has dinner with his wife, and he says, "Where's the ketchup, bitch?" And his wife says, "Out there, not in here." That's for work. Don't bring it home.
Well, exactly. Once it's reached the point of that kind of parody, it is hard to be scared by something, even if it's doing loads of other things.
Yeah, that's so bizarre that because I mean he's a paedophile.
Yes.
When I watched the first one, it was a genuine like, oh, what a horrible thing, and it was kind of morally complex and stuff. But you're right, he became sort of like an anti-hero, I guess.
Yeah, and one of those like the slasher things. Often, they say you're rooting for the person in the mask to kill the teenagers, and so that with Freddy Krueger is particularly icky, because in the later series you're rooting for a deceased resurrected pedophile, burnt face, pedophile finger. It's very complicated, and so on that level, hard to enjoy, hard to laugh off, and equally hard to be scared by, I'd say.
Are there any films that you find too scary that you or kind of unwatchable? You're just like, I just no, I don't want to do that to myself. Like a roller coaster that you think, nope, that's too. They don't have the regulations.
There have been some things over the years that have got close to it. And one of the things with researching for this book is that what you want to find the biting point, so that you're scared, but you're not terrified. Because, say, what if my wife had been out and I'm like, oh, she'd been away. And I'm like, well, I'm in the flat by myself. I'm watching whatever it is. And I'm terrified. In fact, I'm trying to find the most terrifying films ever. So, I mean, there's nothing that I've seen for a while that's on that list. Over the years, things have reached that point, but you see them again and it's not quite so bad. The last thing that really scared me was an Argentine film called Terrified, which is absolutely batshit, and it's included as one of the chapters in the book. I hadn't even heard of it when I started researching, and it is really, it's almost like a kind of it's got a Lovecraftian thing. But it's almost like if someone did the X-rated version of a Stephen King's It, like it's a neighborhood in Buenos Aires beset by horrible creatures, horrible Lovecraftian creatures coming out of the woodwork, out of the drain, attacking children under the bed. It's got that horrible, like something under the bed thing that King does so well, with quite extreme gore and just with no. It's also, you know, so it's a foreign film, so it doesn't have any of that Hollywood safety net. Children die, you know, terrible things happen, and no one's safe, and it's absolutely demented. But that dementedness means you're not quite sure what you're seeing. You're not quite sure where it's going to go. You can't second guess it. And I found that really scary, and I had to turn it off and then watch the rest of it, you know, the next day or something, which is obviously a massive recommendation for in terms of the book. But,
I've written down the title.
yeah, be careful though. That is really scary. Really, really scary, I would say.
Yeah, no, there's no way I'm not going to watch it now. But I am not like the calluses have not formed over my fear muscle. There are certain films like what was that film? The Toolbox Murders, which was called High Tension,
Okay.
I think, in Alexander Ayer.
Yeah. So it was Switchblade Romance in this.
Right, okay. Yeah,
Country,
it's got 2 or 3 different titles. I think in America it was called The Toolbox Murders, and in France it was anyway.
Haute Tension. In France,
that's right. Yeah, that's why I've got that in my head.
That's a good movie. That's in the book.
Yeah, I know. But again, that was a film that I sort of had to sort of keep pausing and having a walk around, and the fast forward rewind button sometimes gets used as well.
What was it about that film? What was it about Switchblade Romance, Haute Tension that got to you?
I just felt there was a real that dread, absolutely, that you knew there was something was going down, and the
something's quite literally going down.
Yeah.
Sorry. Pardon me, sorry.
And also that idea of like the safety goes quite quickly in that film, in the sense that I think the dad gets sort of beheaded right at the very beginning, and he's like, oh wow, there's no one safe. And it was one of those films that, spoiler. Well, I'm not going to spoil it, but the ending, the explanation at the end was really unsatisfactory. It was really like, what the, I'd rather you just not have a twist than have such a silly twist. But it was very effective. I just remember certain sequences. There's a sequence like in a petrol station as well, which is really, really well done and really tense and
really tense, really bloody. And the brakes are off. It's an unsafe movie because you don't know what's going to happen. It does tend to happen more in foreign movies, I find, in non-Hollywood movies. They don't have to tick the boxes. There doesn't have to be a happy ending. In this sense, the ending makes absolutely no sense at all. But who cares? Because the whole thing's terrifying.
Yeah, and I also watched one of those films which was like similar to you talking about Terrified. So somebody said, "Oh, this is an unwatchable film. It's so scary." Was Cannibal Holocaust, the Diodati movie, which has objectionable things in it. Regardless of it has all animal torture in it, unsimulated animal torture and stuff like that. So it's like it's objectionable on those grounds alone, I think. But it is also really, really horrible.
It's a very effective movie, and it's a very obviously we can't. I can't be down with that. I'm vegetarian. I can't be down with people torturing animals on the film. But the film is intelligent, and that's one of the reasons that it's so effective. Because the stupid versions of that film we've all seen as well are just awful.
Like Eli Roth's, for
there
instance.
is an intelligence behind it. I don't think that. No, there's no Eli Roth films in the book.
Well, I would argue that Hostel did have it. I think it had a notoriety because of that idea was a good one, and it was the first of that torture porn sort of idea. Not necessarily the very first, but there was a first sort of mainstream version of that.
I found that in looking for the scariest things, that torture porn doesn't really work for me. So there's some films in there that could be, so Martyrs you could call torture porn, Wolf Creek you can maybe call torture porn, but those are probably the only two in the book that because I think they do lots of other things to try and scare you other than just showing you bodies being flayed. And Posture 1 and 2 were horribly effective. I don't remember them being scary. I just remember them being sort of horrible,
gruesome.
So that's they're not in there. But should there be a Book of Horror sequel, I will bear those two in mind.
Is that a possibility, you think?
Well, it'd certainly be worth an update in a little while, because the latest film in the book is St. Maud, which I saw before it came out, and then it was delayed by COVID. So actually the book came out and the film hadn't come out, which was very rare. So it looks like the book was ahead of its time, but actually it's just how things go with release schedules. But obviously the films in the book end in 2020, and there'll be a ton of new scary stuff released in the years after. So it'd be really cool to revisit it after a certain period of time. Certainly, I am still currently horrored out, and I don't think I'd write an entire book about horror for a little bit.
Yeah, you'd want a 5 or 10 year
pour
gap.
your whole self. Yeah, maybe. Also, this is my one chance to write the book I wanted to write my whole life. I poured my entire body and soul into it, and you can't just do that again 2 years later. You need to find something else to get inspired by.
Yeah. But I mean, it's obviously written by someone with a real passion, and that sort of comes through. And the level of detail as well is really interesting. How I'm Barney. Barney, did he work on your Great Directors book as well?
No, so that was a sort of more sort of graphic artist called Andy Toohey, who did sort of quite colourful, quite sort of diagrammatic pictures of directors' faces.
Yeah,
and that was my first book, but that was Andy's book really that I did the text for.
Right.
This is the other way around. This is my book that Barney did the illustrations for. But so he went off on his own with no brief and did 34 plus just amazing black and white sort of creepy pictures to supplement the text, instead of having something like posters or photos, which is kind of the standard for these things. Actually, there's just a ton of bespoke artwork, which I think is kind of added value. It's
absolutely.
He really conjures the mood that the films do, that perhaps also the text is analyzing things and maybe pulling them apart, whereas I feel like the illustrations are trying to make you scared in the same way the film does. So they work really effectively.
It draws out that atmosphere of each film. Yeah, no, absolutely. They're a real bonus. And it's, and I think that's this sort of film book, which is kind of visual. I hesitate to use the sort of word coffee table book, because I know it's sometimes used as a little bit too negatively or disparagingly. Mm-hmm. But this is a really good book for that. It's a really good book for sort of poring over and just enjoying also, as you say, the look of it, as well as obviously your wonderful words.
Well, hopefully. I mean, there's always, as I said, there's the diagrams and there's the symbols and the scare tactics and the illustrations. The idea being that, we're trying to recreate some of the experience of being in a horror movie, which you can't do with words alone, and also give the reader something more than you can get online, or, more than the idea that this is a whole sort of experiential look at these films. So hopefully some of that comes across. And if it's on a coffee table somewhere, yay! I don't mind that at all. Like more the merrier. So that's great.
Absolutely. And I mean, I think horror is in a sort of really healthy place at the moment. I think there's a lot of great horror movies coming out. You just mentioned Saint Maud, Censor was out. Yeah. You've had films like Midsummer. You had Jordan Peele's films. The new Invisible Man, I thought was a really superb and effective sort of take. Okay, so I've got to ask you a final question, which is, what film book would you recommend, Matt, for our listeners? God damn it! I'll cut that out. I'll cut it out, and I'll make it listeners.
Will you cut the bit out when I tell you to talk about Barney as well?
I'm not cutting anything out. Okay. I've stopped cutting stuff out.
Oh, really? Okay.
No, I'm joking. I mean, maybe I'm not.
Okay. Do you want to ask me again?
No, go ahead. Sorry, I will do. What film book would you recommend for our listeners?
I would recommend a book called Your Face Here by Ali Catterall and Simon Wells. And that is a look at cult British films, such as A Hard Day's Night, Clockwork Orange, The Wicker Man, Naked, all these sort of great offbeat classics of British cinema. And what it does is it's I know Ali, actually, he's a friend of mine. So, but this recommendation would stand anyway. Is what it does is it's as if a book deal was given to two guys and they just went, we're going to write the absolute hell out of it. So there's interviews, they go to the locations, they analyze the films, they analyze the history of sort of the British cult film, and it's a really, really easy, fun read. And I've got to say, it really inspired Britpop cinema. I didn't realize how much, but lots of how I decided to format that and how much I tried to throw into that book is from just loving this Your Face Here. I found myself, I must have read it 10 times over and over again. I just, I'm one of those people that when I like something, I kind of really go at it. So I would highly, highly recommend that to your listeners.
Excellent, brilliant. I'll definitely get a copy of that because I haven't read it. So who knows, potential guests.
Very potential guest, yeah. I'm sure.
Yeah.
Ali would be great on here. Yeah.
I said final question, but let's have another final question as well. How do you? I was waffling on there a little bit about the state of horror at the moment. How do you feel as a big horror fan? How are you? Are you happy with the way things are? Do you have any problems or criticisms?
It's in really rude health, and it seems to be going from strength to strength. I felt at the turn of the millennium we were in a new golden age. I thought that was when I first started thinking about this. I thought we got J-horror, Ringu and all this stuff. We've got Blair Witch Project, torture porn, which sometimes did at least have a sort of political undercurrent, and it felt like lots of stuff happening. Spanish horror was brilliant, and then it just never seemed to end. Like it didn't. There doesn't seem to be a dry patch between then and here. And now, like you said, we were talking about Host earlier. We've got things like His House. People dealing with really genuine, the problems of the world today, quickly, cheaply, and imaginatively through horror movies, as opposed to making sort of an issue movie that people might not see. So I think it's in really rude health. And the more atomized we are, the lockdowns, people can still make horror movies. You can still always say all we need is an idea and a camera. So I think it's going to continue to be in rude health. Hopefully the world will start to heal itself a little bit, and that would be great. And the horror gets worse from it. That would be amazing. But unfortunately, the world's an absolute shit show, and the horror movie is going from strength to strength.
That's a very good point. Yeah. Like the artist who gets all of his, inspiration from being miserable. I don't mind having a bad album every now and again if my life gets better.
Yeah, exactly. I would take the loss of the good horror movies for an improvement in the world's fortunes, truly. But if we have to have one, at least we've got the other.
That's a really good point, and it's a really good point about from the turn of the millennium until now. All those different international traditions. I just came back from the Middle East. I was at a film festival, and places like Saudi Arabia just started making films,
right.
And they're making horror movies. I'd
love to see some of those.
And it's also like, as with J-horror sort of tapped into a whole bunch of folk horror that we don't really have much access to because it's from another culture. So the Middle East has a whole, the idea of jinns and has a whole tapestry of folklore and things to sort of bring out, and we've only just got.
There's Under the Shadow, isn't there?
Yeah,
Under the Shadow from a few years ago, which is Iranian British, I believe, but in which, exactly, draws on a mythology that we don't know, and also against a backdrop of war-torn Tehran, which is a much more dangerous and scary place to live than most of our lives in the West. So it was a really really rich backdrop for a horror movie.
Brilliant, Matt. I really that was really good. Thanks very much for the books. I really enjoyed dipping into them, and I will be definitely sort of referring back to the horror book from time to time.
Yeah, well, if you ever need to know a film, you ever need to watch a film and want something that's going to scare you, guarantee any film in that book has got its scary moments. I swear.
Okay, so that was our conversation. I hope you enjoyed it. Please remember, if you like the episode, to share and like and spread the word. You can email me or get in touch with me via Twitter at Dr. John T. My DMs are open, especially if you have any suggestions of guests or suggestions about the podcast in any way, shape, or form. Thank you so much for your support. Thank you also goes to Elliot Atkins for the music, Ali Harwood for the art, and Matt Glasby for participating. Until next week, please take care.